Hey everybody, this is Alan with Meet the Thriller Author, and today we are talking with Glenn Dyer, and so happy to have him here on the podcast on Zoom. How are you doing this afternoon, Glenn?
I am doing fine, Alan. I'm very grateful. And uh, can't believe I'm actually talking to you. You've had some pretty high power authors on your podcast that I've enjoyed listening to, and I'm very happy, thrilled, and humbled to be amongst them. So thanks for having me.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for coming on. I'm excited to talk to you. I told you offline before. I was a big fan of the OSS, and we'll get into all that as we get going here. But I really like the hook of your books. But before we get into all that, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah. So I grew up in New Jersey and got very, very lucky. I picked a major in college in broadcasting and film. And in that particular career choice, it's very hard to get your first job. It's very important to know somebody already in the business, because it was at least in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, still a pretty small business. Cable hadn't grown to the degree it has to this point in time. And I was lucky enough to get a roommate in my junior year in college who was already working in the television business. And we became fast friends. I got to meet his friends who also worked in the business, and was lucky enough to get a job right out of college. And I stayed in the broadcasting business for about 37 years. It moved me and my family around from Massachusetts to Utah to Dallas, Fort Worth, to Washington, D.C., to Denver, and then back to Utah. So the moving was tough, but it was something you had to do in order to grow within the business. And then I always had an interest in writing, going back to my senior year in high school, and dabbled in it during my broadcasting career, but never worked at it on a full-time basis. Was always distracted by my career and raising a family, and I guess I just wasn't disciplined enough during those years. But when I did take an early retirement and we came back out here to Park City, Utah, it was one of those moments where it was put up or shut up, and I decided to follow through and at least crank out a draft, a full manuscript draft of an idea that I had been working on and off for a number of years. And so that got things going. And I took, there's so much advice out there about not just how you write a novel, but also, the publishing business. And I read early on that it would make a great deal of sense if you wrote a series. One book sort of helps the sales of the next book, and so on. So I came up with a set of characters, and I based those characters during a time of history that I had a great interest in since I was a young kid growing up in New Jersey, and that was World War II. And I figured out that the OSS had a bunch of extremely colorful characters in it, led by a very colorful character in William Donovan. And so it was, from there, things kind of came together. And I'm about ready to release the second book in the series, and am currently working on the third book. So, it was, once I paid attention to or worked full time at it, I was able to pull things together. Although each book is a challenge unto itself, it gets only just a little bit easier with the next book, but it's always a challenge. So that's sort of been my journey.
Yeah, I've interviewed over 100 authors already, at all different levels and all of them suffer about worry about that, and even no matter the level of success, they're like worried about the imposter syndrome and and all that. So I don't think it gets any easier.
No, it really doesn't. Yeah, each project has its own challenges. So, and for me too, actual the writing process itself, it isn't as challenging as the plotting process for me. And I am an outliner, and without an outline, I'll keep going around in circles. So I learned that lesson very, very early on, that I need a pretty well fleshed out, detailed outline. So that's the most challenging part for me.
And was the Torch Betrayal, was that the first book that you published? That's your first one?
Yes, it was. And I mentioned I worked on it for a number of years, and I'm reluctant to say, but I will, that I worked on it on and off for almost 20 years. I think the one danger for me, and I think for a lot of people who are writing historical fiction, is you can really get immersed in the research. And if it's a time period that you've always had an interest in, you can get mired in the research. You just keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper, and you realize, oh my gosh, I haven't written a word in 2 weeks. Yeah, that's the fun part of it. But I've gotten more disciplined about that. With my last book, I did as much research as I felt was necessary to help tell a compelling and believable story. And then if there was something I want to go back after, out of pleasure, I can always do that. So.
And that's the second book is coming out in June, right? That's the Ultra Betrayal.
Yes.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about that story, and tell us about the Conor Thorn?
Yeah. So like the first book, I thought it would be interesting if the premise of the story for the first book, second book, and the third book was inspired by some historical event, some mystery, some questionable situation that maybe the end result wasn't reported. And I thought that would sort of be a nice leaping off point to build a story around. So in book one, I read about a document that was going to be a part of General Eisenhower's wartime diary. And this document had the key directives for Operation Torch. And this document went missing during a process of microfilming. And the document was never found. And this information was reported by Eisenhower's naval aide, Harry Butcher. And I just thought, well, if the invasion still occurred, something must have happened to the document that they felt secure enough about to not postpone the invasion. So I built a story around that event. In the second book, I came across in my research a story about a Polish engineer who was Jewish, who worked in a German factory that was building Enigma machines. And these machines were used to send and receive coded messages from the high commands down to forces in the field. He sold some information to the British to help them figure out how to break the Enigma codes. He was flown when the Germans were closing in on Paris. He was flown to safety in England. And then as soon as he arrived, a couple days later, he went missing. So this engineer, mathematician who had direct knowledge of the level of success of the British in breaking German codes, he goes missing and is never found. For me, that was a nice leaping off point too. So the story about the Ultra Betrayal is Conor Thorn and his partner, Emily Bright, are eventually assigned the mission of tracking down this traitor before he can consummate a deal with the Nazis. And that whole adventure takes them to Stockholm, Sweden. And I thought that setting was a little bit different than, Paris and, even Lisbon. I mean, Stockholm was like Lisbon and some other neutral country capitals, was a real hotbed of espionage, and something that not a lot of people were aware of, I felt. So I thought that was a very good setting. So I like the idea of an actual event being the inspiration for the story. For me, at least, it makes it a little more interesting.
Yes, I love that stuff. I like one of my favorite books is Ken Follett's Eye of the Needle, which is all about the Allied invasion of Normandy. So it kind of reminds me of these.
Yeah, a classic World War II spy book, probably one of the top 5 that were ever written about that time.
Yeah. So how is it? Is that a challenge for you though to keep it, all the spy thriller, the action elements that thriller readers want, but then staying true to the history? How challenging is that?
Yeah, it is. It's very challenging. As you know, in certain genres, you have conventions that readers expect, and then when you layer on the fact that the thriller takes place in a historical environment, there's certain things that readers will accept, and certain things that, as soon as they stumble across them, and if they're not right, they put the book down. So you do have to be careful. The books that I write do include real historical characters like Bill Donovan and Churchill, and I throw in some cameos from people like the actress Hedy Lamarr and David Niven, and the words you put in their mouths have to reflect who their characters were and the type of people they were. You can't really have them acting against what historically happened. You might want to, massage when something happened by, for dramatic purposes, by maybe, a few days or a week or two. But you've got to be very, very careful. And too, writers get tripped up all the time about using wrong terminology, or, saying somebody, was riding in a car that in that particular year hadn't been introduced. And you just don't want to get tripped up with things like that. So, which is why you do have to spend a good deal of time on your research. And those are things that even a good editor, you can't rely on them to find. That's up to you to do. So, yeah, it's a challenge, and yet it is a little. If you like history, it's sort of thrilling writing a scene, that takes place between Winston Churchill and General Eisenhower. You want to be true to events, but you're also trying to write a dramatic piece of literature. So,
in this case, people don't know the OSS was the precursor of the CIA,
right?
And a lot of like you mentioned before, that had a lot of great quirky characters or strange characters. And I remember, something like the CIA. Jesus James Angleton was a big counterintelligence guy in the CIA, and he started in the OSS. A lot of those old guys started in the OSS.
Yeah.
Is that what drew to you as well? And it wasn't Donovan, was a Wild Bill, right? He was his
Wild
nickname.
Bill.
Yeah.
A nickname that he got from his days in World War I, where he was a very dynamic and successful leader in the army, and he happened to know President Roosevelt, became not a protege, but almost an envoy. And before the United States got into the war, spent a lot of time in England talking to members of British intelligence, and he was tasked by Roosevelt to go over and see what's going on and come back with some sort of conclusion as to whether the British are going to make it through the early years of the war. And so he did a lot of work and got very cozy with a lot of people in British intelligence. And it convinced him that the United States, who at that point in time, as late as 1940, really didn't have an aggressive intelligence operation. Each, the Army did, the Navy did, but there wasn't an overall organization that coordinated intelligence gathering. So he convinced FDR of the need, and away he went. And he attracted a lot of people from Ivy League schools, a lot of people who had very interesting personalities. I think everybody has heard that, Julia Child was a member of the OSS, and Sterling Hayden, who was a famous actor in Hollywood, had a very colorful OSS career. And there's a lot of people that were in the OSS who came out of the war and never spoke of their activities, but he attracted an eclectic group of people. The British thought they were all, cowboys, and acted in an undisciplined way, couldn't keep secrets, were impulsive and spontaneous. And so a lot of those characteristics I gave to my main protagonist, Conor Thorn, as a guy who acted impulsively and sometimes like a bull in a china shop. And he's been a fun character to get to know and to write about.
Do you have one specific historical character in mind when you were writing, developing Conor, or is it from all different sorts of different people?
Yeah, and actually, they say it's good to have a real life Hollywood character that sort of exemplifies your protagonist's attitude or character. So, it has nothing to do with World War II, the OSS, but the actor Chris Pine, who played a young Captain Kirk in the Star Wars movies, no, not Star Wars, Star Trek movies, acted very impulsively, didn't follow orders, thought he knew what was right, did a lot of things from his gut, was able to lead and convince others to follow him. I kind of liked that as a foundation of the character. But, what I've read about the OSS, colorful characters were the norm, and with backgrounds that in some cases go back to World War I, but people who just wanted to continue to serve their country but couldn't do so in the military, so they raised their hand and said to Bill Donovan, I'm your guy, I know how this works, take me on. So so I'd have to say he's probably a composite character as far as OSS agents are concerned, but something fresh in my mind, like a Chris Pine as Captain Kirk, was helpful in figuring out what Conor would do in certain situations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a movie a few months ago. The Catcher was a spy. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Mo Berg, I didn't realize he was an OSS, the baseball star.
Yeah, he had a really interesting career with the OSS, especially later in the war, when things as far as the Axis was concerned, or by that point in time, just Germany, was looking really, really bleak. In fact, my third book does revolve around the German atomic bomb program. And, as you remember in the movie, he was tasked with contacting Werner Heisenberg, who was heading up the German atomic bomb program, and to sort of ascertain just how far along the Germans were in actually building a bomb. And the movie was pretty good. And the research I'm doing right now, Heisenberg was a very interesting character himself.
Yeah, I didn't even realize he was an actual person. I don't know if you're familiar with that TV show Breaking Bad, but that's Walter White uses that as an alias, Heisenberg, and it was based
You know what?
on that guy.
I haven't watched all seasons, and I've only watched a handful of episodes, but I did not know that.
Yeah, it's like his favorite chemist was Heisenberg.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
That's funny.
So what's your writing process like then? Once you're ready to sit down and start writing, can you kind of walk us through just? I know it's hard to say what's your a regular writing day like, but what's it like?
Well, as I said, I'm definitely a plotter, and so I need to have that's pretty solid outline. And like Lee Goldberg said, one of your previous guests, he outlines, doesn't go crazy with the length of the outline, but he has a living outline, and I think that's really smart to have, because once you get into the story, you realize, okay, it works, but maybe not as good as I wanted it to. Maybe I need to go back in and tweak my outline. So it for me, it starts with a solid outline. But even before that, like I said, I like to find a piece of history that, could present as a part of a premise, a good what if. And if I can find that event, that somebody might be interested in what the answer is or how something got solved, then I work on the outline, add as much research into it as I think I need to start the writing process. And then for me, like I said, the writing, I have good days, I have bad days, and you try to stick with it when you're having a really good day, when things are flowing, and not just from a word count standpoint, but that the words you're writing just really feel good, and you just feel like you're in a zone. So I don't have a word count goal on a daily basis. I don't feel like I'm one of the types who doesn't want to force the issue. If one day just doesn't feel right, maybe what I do on that day is do some book marketing, some outreach, take a look at, what I can do with social media that I hadn't done in a while, all those necessary evils. So yeah, I try to be, I try to be a little forgiving as far as, how much I do and how often I do it. But once I have my outline, I definitely want to keep momentum going to the best of my ability, and just to get that first really crappy first draft done. And then I take a little bit of a break, maybe a couple of weeks, let it percolate a little bit, and then go back and probably, before I send anything to an editor, I'll probably do 2 or 3 more drafts. I just started with my second book, sending my outline out before I started to write, just to see if I was on the right track, and that saves some time, and I definitely will continue to do that.
Oh, so you send the outline to an editor, or?
Yeah, developmental editor, just to see if listen, there's still so much to learn about the writing process, and I admit that I'm a novice. I'm still learning a lot, and I'm definitely smart enough to listen to advice. And if I'm missing some big elements, if my subplots just aren't working or getting in the way, if my main antagonist isn't bad enough, or if I haven't clearly stated what their goals are, I think it saves a lot of time. So and that helps keep the writing momentum going too, when you're not stopping down often to, ask yourself the question, is my antagonist mean enough? Well, it's already been asked. It's already been answered. So.
And what tools do you use to write your stories? You use like Word or another writing processor?
Yeah. Okay. So I have to admit that I have owned Scrivener for maybe 6 years, and every time I hear an author say they can't live without it, like Joanna Penn, I then go back and try to get my head back into it, and each time I do, I get a little further along, but I still find it really complicated, and I'm pretty good technically, but again, still learning a lot. So in the meantime, what I typically do is write in Word, which can be cumbersome, especially when you want to start moving scenes and chapters around. There's a lot of cutting, copying, and pasting, and that can get kind of old. So once I get this outline for book 3 done, I think I'm going to spend a good couple of weeks with Scrivener to see if I can't, get the most out of it for this next book. I'm again going to give it another whack, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think I had Scrivener for several years too before I finally clicked together. Because it's at first it could be a little overwhelming.
Yeah. So, but the new release, I've taken some tutorials, does seem to offer up a lot of baked-in tools that I think help writers pull manuscripts together.
Yeah. So, were you a fan of the spy thrillers, like thrillers in general, as a reader before you started to write your own books?
Yeah, I think I've read a great deal of World War II historical fiction. I have read a ton of W.E.B. Griffin books.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a couple of series based in World War II, but other series based on Vietnam and CIA and so on. I think that one of the first books that I read that I just got so interested in was Herman Wouk's book, The Winds of War and War and Remembrance. I think he evoked the setting of before the United States got into the war, but what people living in Italy before the war started, but what life was like. And one of the things that interested me about World War II is that it was such a catastrophic, tumultuous event that impacted so many people, either directly or indirectly. Unfortunately, much like the COVID crisis is doing right now, with gratefully not as much loss of life, but the fact that it was in some ways a romantic time, a time that people harken back to as the good old days, even though there was a lot of terror attached to it. But some of those books for me evoked a time that I could could immerse myself in and sort of get lost in. And I think for a long time I've always wanted to write a book that could take somebody back and make them really feel what it was like to live through that period of time of uncertainty, of great loss, of deprivation. It just still boggles my mind the amount of countries, the loss of life, the amount of destruction. I've read a lot of books, and both. And by the way, not just fiction, but nonfiction too. There's some great books out there that really get down into the weeds as far as what happened and why things happened, and so on. So.
Yeah, I think that's great too that you're keeping up that history alive, because I would imagine that I believe most of what was that now? So we were talking about 70, 80 years ago that this happened, and I'm sure a
Yep.
lot of the OSS agents are probably are starting to die off now. Probably not too many of them left
Yep.
now.
You're right. you're right. One of the things that I do, and I sort of have taken this cue from Steve Berry, who writes the Cotton Malone series. His books are deeply immersed in historical phenomena and events and things, historical mysteries. And one of the things that he does, besides writing great thrillers, is at the back of his book, he'll explain things, the historical background of certain things, what was real, what he might have played with dramatically, excuse me. And I learn a lot from that section, his author notes. And I've done that with my first two books, and just to let people know, where did I play with things dramatically, maybe going into greater detail about something I mentioned briefly in the book, giving readers titles of books I used in my research that if they were interested might want to go back and read about. And I think that I'd like to think that's helpful in keeping the history of that event fresh for people.
Yeah, and I also noticed you got a great blurb from Steve Berry. That's
Yeah,
for your
on
book.
book one and book two. And I was very pleased to get a really nice blurb from Jack Carr, who's pretty hot right now as a thriller writer. His third book was just became a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller. So really pleased that he liked what he read.
So what's next then for you? You say you're working on the third book. What's next for you and Connor?
Yeah, as I said, I've been doing research on the German atomic program, but the idea germinated from some piece of research that I stumbled upon. There was an Italian physicist who was apparently an extremely brilliant theoretician who, in 1938, went missing, and his body it was never found. A lot of people think he attempted suicide while on a ship going from Palermo to Naples, and so he disappeared. And speaking of Werner Heisenberg, the two of them were very, very close friends. So I'm going to build a story about what happened to this Italian physicist, and it will involve Heisenberg and the Germans needing some help with their program and discovering that this physicist is still alive, and I think I'm going to have him hiding in a monastery somewhere. So Connor, OSS finds out about it, and Connor is put in charge of tracking down the physicist before the Germans can, and it's sort of a race against the clock. So I've been doing a lot of research on the physicist. His name is Ettore Majorana, and he even Enrico Fermi said he was as brilliant as Galileo and Newton. So he was quite an interesting man. So that's what I'm doing, researching right now, and hope to be deep in the writing process in maybe another 4 weeks. So we'll see.
Awesome. And so the second book, the Ultra Betrayal, that's out in June. Right?
June 9th. It's available for pre-order right now. But yeah, June 9th. I'm a few months behind because the edit process took a little longer than I anticipated, but finally the date's around the corner.
Great. Yeah, looking forward to it. And so before I let you go, I always ask my guests any advice for aspiring writers that are watching or listening to this?
Well, first of all, I would say if you harbor a desire to write a novel, don't wait until you're 60 years old like I was. It doesn't give you much time to crank out a 10 book series. But I think the one big piece of that advice is that there's a lot to learn, not just about writing or marketing or just publishing business in general, but you need to reach out for help. It may cost you something, but I think if you're really serious about writing, you've got to invest in yourself. And I think finding that editor you really like and work well with, finding a book cover designer who really knows their stuff and that you also work well with, you'll benefit from that on a long-term basis. So, seeking advice, even if you have to pay for it, and if you're serious about it, you got to get busy. You got to be more disciplined than I was. So I think those are the two big pieces of advice.
Great. That's great advice. And then people can find you at your website, glenndyer.net. Is that the best place?
That's it. And the website's a constant project in development, but yeah, that's a good place to get me. And you could also reach me direct on glenndyerauthor@gmail.com. So both work well.
Okay, great. All right, Glenn, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Alan, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.